Hello and welcome into another episode of Locked On Wolves. Today on the show, ESPN stat win predictions are out from Kevin Pelton. We'll take a look at where the Wolves are, plus the Rudy Gobert season preview. What can the Timberwolves expect from Rudy coming to Minnesota? How does the fit with both the starters and the bench unit work? We're going to preview all that here today on the show. Welcome in. You are Locked On Wolves.
You are Locked On Timberwolves, your daily Minnesota Timberwolves podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Hello and welcome to the Locked On Wolves podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. My name is Ben Beecken. I'm the host of Locked On Wolves. Today's episode is brought to us by BetOnline. BetOnline has us covered with more props, odds, and lines than ever before. BetOnline, where the game starts. Happy Friday, everybody. Happy weekend. Hopefully you've had a fantastic week and are ready for preseason basketball because it's about to happen. The Timberwolves tip off on Tuesday against the Heat. Today on the show, plenty to get to. I want to start with the ESPN win total projections. Then I want to get into the Rudy Gobert season preview. We'll do a couple segments on that here today, what Wolves fans can expect from Rudy Gobert. First, though, a big thank you for making Locked On Wolves your first listen each and every day. Of course, this show is free and available everywhere. That includes YouTube, as well as all of your favorite audio platforms from Apple to Google, Spotify to Odyssey. Wherever you find podcasts, you can find Locked On Wolves. You can also follow the show on Twitter at Locked On T Wolves and at Beecken with two B's, two E's, CKEN. Let's start with the Kevin Pelton ESPN stats-based win projections, as they are titled. And these are some of my favorite projections every year. I meant to go back and look and see where the Wolves were predicted last year, but I believe that they were like ninth. I think that they were higher than most people had the Wolves, but a little bit lower than where they actually finished. Of course, my prediction for the Wolves was similar to that. I think I had them 8th or 9th before last season. Of course, they ended up finishing 7th in the West and outperforming most expectations. This projection system is the best in my opinion because it is stats based, and they take a 3-year sample of a couple of these different advanced metrics, which I'll explain here in a minute. Well, I won't fully explain the metric, but I'll explain the methodology behind ESPN's ranking. And so it's not influenced by bias. In fact, Kevin Pelton, who writes this, even says within the article, I think this team will finish higher than this projection because there's factors that can't be factored in, right? So for instance, this is a 3-year sample. Availability matters. So it accounts for how often players have missed games over the past 3 years. Of course, we've had a lot of, on top of injuries, we've had a lot of COVID-related, health and safety protocol-related absences from really good players over the past 3 years. So that impacts these projections a little bit. We obviously don't know who will miss games due to injury this year. And also, he doesn't mention this, but players have been resting a lot too. Even if they're not quote unquote injured, if they're a little bit banged up, guys aren't playing 82 games typically like Kevin Garnett did back in the day, right? Or 81 if he would, typically rest the last day of the regular season if the Wolves had a playoff spot sewn up. So that is a little bit noisy, and he talks about how some teams may outperform projections for various reasons. It's also hard to project rookies, etc. So, but this gives you a baseline, right? And then you can go up or down based on some of these other factors. So I want to quickly mention where the Wolves are and my thoughts on that. The other thing is the win totals are all going to be a little bit lower, just because this is in a vacuum projecting this team. If other teams have guys hurt, of course, they're going to be worse than projected, which means the better teams are going to be better because they're going to beat those teams with a higher frequency. So, like, for instance, Phoenix is projected as the number 1 seed with 49 wins. They're going to win more than 49 games this year. This is the average total based on this projection, which is the shown player projections from Kevin Pelton, and then the ESPN's RAPM, which I cite quite a bit individually. The regularized adjusted for factors, or I guess that's actually different than the real plus minus, but it's a similar metric. This one's from NBAShotCharts.com. So Kevin Pelton takes those metrics together and then ranks these teams based on what they spit out for an average win total. So the Suns are number 1 at 49 wins. Again, the win total I don't think is super important here. Denver is second with 47.9. Those make sense to me. I understand Denver too. I don't know that they'll really finish second in the West. But the Suns at 1 make a lot of sense. Number 3, the New Orleans Pelicans really did surprise me. Having New Orleans 3 was not what I was expecting. Kevin Pelton writes, my projections are high in the Pelicans' chances of making a leap. With a full season of CJ McCollum and Larry Nance Jr., who were acquired in February, as well as the healthy return of Zion Williamson, New Orleans was 3.8 points per game better than average with McCollum in the lineup, and backed it up in a hard-fought opening round loss against Phoenix. Add in Zion, conservatively forecast for 1,400 minutes. Of course, trying to factor in, is he going to get hurt again? Realistically, you have to consider the probability that he might. The Pelicans could force their way to a crowded West playoff picture. It still feels high to me to put the Pelicans 3, but I guess I understand how he gets there. Memphis at 4 also surprised me a little bit. He even mentions that they lost 2 key reserves in D'Anthony Melton and Kyle Anderson, of course, the latter of whom is with the Wolves. And then he says they project better than their replacements. Also, Jaren Jackson Jr. is only penciled in for 49 games as he returns from surgery to repair a stress fracture in his right foot. And last year, of course, Memphis won 56 games. So he's got them fourth with 46 and admits that they're worse than they were last year. So I would be really surprised if Memphis finished. I shouldn't say really surprised. I don't think Memphis will finish ahead of the Wolves. I obviously think the Grizzlies are still good, but them losing those big bench pieces and Jaren Jackson Jr. likely not playing until Christmas or later, that matters quite a bit. So also then he's got the Wolves at 5. He's got the Timberwolves at 5 at 45.7 wins. Of course, they won 46 last year. Rounding up, this is 46 again. I think it's absurd to consider the fact the Wolves might only win the same number of games unless you're assuming that their injury luck will be worse. And I really hope it's not. We all do. But they had pretty good injury luck last year, all things considered. So I'll read what Pelton says. He says the Timberwolves are perhaps the most interesting of the 5 teams projected to finish in the top 5 in both offense and defensive rating, after they finished just outside that group last year, 13th in defensive rating last season. The addition of 3-time Defensive Player of the Year, Rudy Gobert, naturally boosts Minnesota at that end. So he says here, the Wolves, in his projections, should finish top 10 in defensive rating and offensive rating. Not a surprise. Again, they were top 10 offensive last year, and they were just outside the top 10 defensive without Rudy last season. So he's got the Wolves at 5. I'll list the next couple, and then I'll get back to the Wolves. The Clippers are at 6 at 43.6 wins, so a full 2 wins behind the Wolves, which is pretty significant. Like, for example, the Wolves are only 0.4 wins behind the Grizzlies in 4th. The Clippers drop-off is more than 2 wins behind the Wolves. Mavs at 7 at 43.1 wins. Warriors at 8, and then a huge drop-off to Lakers 9, Trailblazers 10, Kings 11, and so on and so forth. A couple surprises here. I was surprised the Clippers were as low as 6, but I want to underscore this, and I probably should have said this off the top. This is regular season finish. And Pelton points out in his intro that the teams that finished as the number 1 seed in both conferences over the past 2 seasons, none of them have reached the NBA Finals. So 8 teams over the last 2 years have finished with the number 1 seed. And they have not reached the finals, which is just crazy. Sorry, 4 teams. I don't know why I said 8. Over the last 2 seasons, the 4 number 1 seeds, 2 conferences, 2 seasons, 2 times 2 is 4. Out of those 4, none have reached the NBA Finals. And so he points out that, regular season, not just success, but dominance hasn't always equaled playoff success and obviously dominance. So that's important to remember. I mean, Utah's a great example. They have the best record in the Western Conference over the last 6 years. I think it is 5 or 6 years, but have never gotten to the finals, much less to the conference finals, right? They were always a second round exit team. So does that portend the same thing for Rudy in Minnesota? Obviously not. This is a different team, right? There's more. We've talked about this at length, more talent around Rudy, et cetera. But it's important to underline that here because we're talking about regular season success. Are the Wolves going to be better than the Clippers this year? Most people would say no. What was the survey just a few weeks ago? The Clippers were by far the leader to people thought would emerge from the West as the Western Conference champions and go to the NBA Finals. And yet they're ranked behind the Wolves by a full 2 wins in Pelton's projections. Because who knows what we're going to get in the regular season from Paul George and Kawhi Leonard. He doesn't have them forecast for full seasons, which is the biggest reason why. The projections have Paul George at 64 out of 82 games and Kawhi at 57 out of 82 games. And we all know, the absence of Kawhi for the entire season last year and Paul George's early injury. What will that look like this season? He still got them 6th. A lot of people think they'll end up winning the West, and it's entirely possible they finish 4th or 5th in the Western Conference, but those guys get healthy and play full-time in the playoffs, which is a big if. They could come out of the West. So the regular season ranking of 5 feels about right to me. I've been saying that they'll finish 3-5 in the West, all summer. I'm not making my official win projection yet. I'm saving that until closer to the regular season. I do think they'll finish ahead of Memphis. I do think they'll finish ahead of New Orleans. I don't know for sure that they'll finish ahead of the Clippers, Mavericks, and Warriors. Real quick, he talks about the loss of Brunson as the key reason for the Mavs dropping. And then also, can they maintain their defensive success last year, which was a bit of a surprise. Then he's got the Warriors down at 8 and says he thinks he specifically calls out the Warriors as likely to outperform their projection and be near the top of the West. He says that this gets dragged down by how bad they were a couple of years ago. Remember, this is a 3-year sample. And then also losing Otto Porter Jr. and Gary Payton II, who were both fantastic in terms of some of these advanced metrics, that will pull it down too, where he admits the metrics could actually overstate how impactful those guys were. So I think Golden State and LA both finish ahead of the Wolves. I don't think that the Grizzlies do, and I don't think the Pelicans do. It wouldn't shock me if the Mavs did. So that would put the Wolves at 4th or 5th in the West, which feels about right to me. I do think that's the range they'll be in, is 3-5. I think they're more likely to be 4, 3 or 4 than they are to be 5. But not my final projection. We'll get to that here in a couple of weeks before the regular season kicks off. All right. Let's spend the rest of the show talking about one Rudy Gobert and giving his preview based on what he's done, his impact on the court. We've obviously talked a lot about him this offseason, but we haven't really gotten super in the weeds on some of the metrics really since the trade happened in July. So I want to talk about the things that he is absolutely best at and where I think his role will be in the Wolves' overall, game-long rotation, not simply just as a starter, but what's the mix and match look like with the bench unit. So we'll do that here next. First, let's talk about our title sponsors from today's show, and that is our friends at BetOnline. BetOnline.net is your number one source for football betting info this season. You can find all the latest player developments, team matchups, news, podcasts, and in-depth articles and analysis on every game you can find. It's another football weekend. The Gophers take on Illinois I keep saying that. They take on Purdue on Saturday morning. And then on Sunday, the Vikings are, of course, in London, and they're playing early in the morning on Sunday. So a big football weekend ahead. Make sure that you get to BetOnline to play. As always, BetOnline remains your continued source for all your sport wagering information with live betting and up-to-the-minute scores for every sport that's out there. BetOnline is absolutely the way to go for all of your betting needs. It's the fastest and easiest way to check in on all your favorite games and events, including MLB, MMA, boxing, and golf. Head to betonline.net or use your mobile device to learn more. BetOnline, where the game starts. All right, let's continue the show today by talking about Rudy Gobert and what he brings to the table. One of the initial reactions, I'm not going to talk about the trade return, obviously, right? We're talking about Rudy's on-court impact, so we're not going to focus on what the Wolves gave up to get Rudy Gobert in the trade this summer. But in terms of his on-court impact, there's never really been any concern for me. I know I started the offseason, and if you're a regular listener to the show, I spent some time talking about how, the Wolves are rumored to be interested in Walker Kessler in the draft. Obviously, they did draft him and then ultimately trade him. Other bigs that they were rumored to be interested in, and I was of the opinion that they didn't need to go big and invest in going big. Well, the difference here is obviously they went big in a big way. They got the league's best defensive big, one of the best 2 or 3 defensive players in the entire league, and ultimately one of the best 3 or 4 centers in the entire league, probably the 4th best center in the league, all things considered. But now they have 2 of the top 4, and if you're gonna go all in, right? There's really no concern for me in terms of offensive fit. We've talked about this on the show before as well, but Karl-Anthony Towns has played next to Gorgie Jang. He's played next to Taj Gibson. He's played next to Jared Vanderbilt. Rudy's better than all of them in terms of his offensive, well, all the way around, he's better than all of them, but his offensive game is far better than any of those 3 players. And this is also early career Gorgie before he could stretch the floor. This is, late stage Taj Gibson. He wasn't doing much offensively at all. And Jared Vanderbilt obviously wasn't an impact offensively either. He didn't do much on the offensive glass and didn't do much, in terms of catching the ball. It wasn't a great pick and roll partner. So no matter what happens, Rudy Gobert is a better offensive player than all 3 of those guys. Now, obviously, he wants the ball more than them. He's a higher usage type player, That's he wants to be involved in the offense. He's going to want the ball. So that has to be factored in as well. However, he's so good in pick and roll game that it's a perfect match. The Wolves were doing that anyway with guys that weren't as good with it, with Jared Vanderbilt among others. And so to have Rudy available to those same actions is fantastic. And also, there's so many other possibilities that are opened up for head coach Chris Finch. I mean, let's take a look at some of those offensive numbers for Rudy. I've talked kind of matter-of-factly about his roll gravity. And if you're not familiar with that term, basically, if he's in pick and roll, if he's setting a screen and he's rolling to the rim, guys have to pay attention to the 7'2" guy with the massive wingspan, awesome feel around the basket. Like, people are sucked into what Rudy Gobert is doing. That you can't ignore Rudy Gobert rolling down the middle of the paint, diving to the rim. That you could ignore Jared Vanderbilt. Undersized, not great hands, not great touch around the rim. You can't ignore Rudy Gobert. So if Rudy is able to continue doing that in the Wolves offense, and he will be, that's going to be a huge shift. The numbers bear that out as well. So if we look at the actual pick and roll numbers at B-Ball Index, his roll man numbers are among the best in the entire league, which is, of course, not a surprise. And also finishing at the rim as well. Points per possession as a roll man, Rudy Gobert, 1.29 points per possession, which is an A+, and 99th percentile, basically the best in the league in terms of his actual points per possession. But remember, when I talk about roll gravity, that goes beyond the points per possession. That includes he doesn't even get the ball in the possession as he's rolling, but he's impacting the play to an extent that the defense is essentially, it's like a vacuum is getting sucked into Rudy, or like a vortex type effect. And then the ball can kick to an open shooter on the perimeter, or whoever's got the ball in their hands can break down the defense, etc. That all is made possible by Rudy's ability as a roller. As a screener, we know he's fantastic. If you've ever listened to Locked On Jazz, our friend David Locke, host of Locked On Jazz and the Jazz radio announcer, loves screen assists. Everybody involved with the Jazz loves screen assists, and we're going to talk a lot about it on this show here moving forward too. But screen assists per 75 possessions was 7.3, which is insane. A+, 99th percentile again for Rudy Gobert. That's, again, a screen leading to a made basket per 75 possessions. 88% of the time that Rudy sets a screen, he's rolling to the basket. He only slip screens 12% of the time. And of course, he does not pop to the perimeter at all. He's not a perimeter threat. So he's rolling 88% of the time, slipping 12% of the time, which is a pretty good ratio. I mean, you obviously can't slip too much more than that, or the defense is going to expect it. His total roll man impact per 75 possessions, 92nd percentile, which is an A. And all those other pick and roll numbers, except for the pop number, are A's and A pluses. There's one A- in there. It's fantastic. His ability to set screens and to impact the game is pretty unbelievable. Also, we talk, it's kind of well known, Rudy Gobert doesn't have much of a post game, right? He's not posting up trying to score. There were infamously, there were some situations in the playoffs where teams were sticking smalls on him and he couldn't score in the post. Now, there's a lot to talk about there, but I do want to point out one stat at B-Ball Index. Talks about his post pin frequency, which the definition for post pin frequency is the frequency of post up scoring chances where the player executes a post pin, meaning they gain inside position on the defender before they get the lob, which means they usually get an easy basket. In Rudy's case, shooting 70+% around the rim. That's almost always the case. His post pin frequency was an A-, 83rd percentile league wide, an A-, 12.2% of the time. He's able to seal his defender and get a pin, or and essentially get the ball with a wide open look at the basket because of his technique on that end of the floor. Not only is he a massive human, he's very, very, very skilled in terms of, you can't be that good of a shot blocker and rebounder if you don't know how to control your body extremely well. And that comes into play when it comes to pinning guys in the post as well. And Rudy's number is really strong there too. Of his defense, those numbers are all fantastic as well. On B-Ball Index, obviously the interior defense for Rudy Gobert is second to none. The defensive rebounding numbers are all A+. Defensive rebound positioning is an A+. Defensive rebound conversion skill, an A+. His crashing skill, rebounds per game, rebound chances, all A+ at B-Ball Index. And I mean, like, what else do you say about that? We know he's a fantastic shot blocker. We know he's one of the best in the league in all these areas. And having that added to what the Wolves are able to do already defensively as a top half of the league team last year is really, really significant. And it really can't be denied. No matter what stats you look at, it bears out just how good he is defensively. I want to finish the show by talking about some of the rotation stuff and also a couple of quick Rudy stats. Not B-ball index stats, but just other things to pay attention in terms of how good he was last season specifically. Even though the Jazz were disappointing, how good he was last year, some numbers that were the best in his career as he comes to the Wolves. We'll also look at the rotation here to close the show. All right, last season, Rudy Gobert, believe it or not, averaged the most free throw attempts per game that he ever has in his career. Second best free throw ever next to when he was a limited player as a rookie. But his most free throw attempts per game ever, and it was his best free throw shooting percentage of his career. Last season, 69%. Obviously not amazing, but up over 62% the year prior, 63% the year before that. He had 1 year where he was 68%, but for his career, he's still under 64% as a free throw shooter, averaging more than 5 attempts per game. There have been times where teams have played hack a Rudy, but if you're at 69%, you're pushing that 70% mark. Teams aren't going to be too excited to commit a foul on you. And also now there's the new take foul rule as well, which that'll come up at some point. We'll obviously talk about it on a post-game show, but you can't simply get a take. Patrick Beverley was a master at the take foul, right? You don't want to give up the transition bucket. So you foul, away from the ball or whatever to try and force the other team to inbound the ball from the side. But now it's an automatic free throw plus possession, just like I guess it's not the same as a clear path because it's not 2 shots in the ball. It's 1 shot and the ball. So teams aren't going to commit take balls very often. That will help Rudy in terms of not having to go to the line as frequently. I guess the free throw rate will come down probably, but either way, if he's pushing 70% on free throw shooting, teams are going to be less excited to foul him in the paint, if he's going up for an easy basket. But at any rate, he had his highest free throw attempt per game last year, almost 7 attempts per game that he ever had in his career, and his best shooting percentage from the free throw line, 69% last season. Both really encouraging numbers, and he's entering his age 30 season. So he's still in his prime, but shooting numbers are something like, even if he begins to decline physically, those numbers shouldn't, right? Those should basically stay the same. If he's figured out his free throw stroke, if he's continuing to work on in the offseason and improve, that shouldn't go anywhere. So that's incredibly encouraging. We talked already about all the advanced stats with his roll game, his post pin frequency as a rebounder, as an interior defender, best rebound rate, best defensive rebounds per game, best rebounds per game of any player in the entire NBA last season. So, I mean, you add arguably the league's best rebounder. I think you could say still arguably the league's best defender in terms of overall impact, but certainly a top 3 or 4 defender, a multi-time defensive player of the year, to a team that was already good defensively and just needed help on the glass. That matters. There's an obvious positive impact there on the glass and on defense. And anything he provides offensively, frankly, is gravy. But we know that he'll be better offensively than what the Wolves already had. So any suggestion that the Wolves won't clearly be better than their 46 wins that they managed last year is pretty crazy to me. In terms of the rotation and how Rudy's minutes may be staggered, well, we know he'll start at the 5 next to Karl-Anthony Towns. We'll do the Towns preview on Monday. I've talked a little bit about it in regard to D'Angelo Russell and Anthony Edwards earlier this week, what I think their staggered rotation will look like. So it kind of plays off of that. Rudy Gobert is likely to play. I mean, he played roughly 32 minutes a game. Yeah, 32 a game last year, 30 the year before, 34 the year before that. He's probably right in that 32 to 33 minute per game range again. He's going to start at the 5 next to Towns. My expectation, and this is completely just guessing based on what makes sense to me, is Rudy sits around the 5-6 minute mark of the first quarter. Towns stays in with Ant. D'Lo eventually sits as well. Rudy and D'Lo on the bench, and Rudy and D'Lo come back to start the second quarter while Towns and Ant get their break. And then there's some more minutes at the end of the second quarter, obviously depending on foul trouble, et cetera, where those guys will come back together mostly as a starting group. So I think the D'Lo Rudy minutes and the Ant Cat minutes can be staggered. Why does that make the most sense? Well, D'Lo's the best passer of the group. Rudy's the best roller and diver of the group, right? I mean, Ant can pass, Towns can roll, but Towns is best as a popper. Ant's best attacking. D'Lo is best as a facilitator. D'Lo is also better off the dribble right now as a shooter than Anthony Edwards. He just is. Whether that's pulling up from the mid range, it's Ant's got a better step back, but D'Lo has no qualms with pulling from 28 feet either. So having Rudy set a screen and D'Lo and Rudy pick and roll, D'Lo is one of the better pick and roll ball handlers in the league. Rudy is the best diver roll man in the league. So that pick and roll duo is going to be absolutely unstoppable. Also, Rudy can help cover D'Lo and his issues defensively. Ant's a better on-ball defender by far than D'Angelo Russell. And theoretically, there should be better contained on the perimeter when Ant's on the floor versus D'Lo. So having Rudy on the back line when D'Lo is at times playing Olay defense, again, improved last year, but at times playing Olay defense on the perimeter, that's a really nice safety valve to have. So I think Rudy makes a lot of sense in that pairing with D'Angelo Russell defensively. Now, I think the coverages will also change. We talked at length about this too. I think the Wolves will probably be playing drop coverage 2/3 to 3/4 of the time this year. They hardly ever did it last year. Prior to last year, when David Vanterpool was running the defense and Ryan Saunders was head coach, that's really all they did was drop coverage. Karl-Anthony Towns was bad as a big defending drop coverage. Again, the explanation there is the big essentially sags into the paint to try and keep from getting beat and on dribble drive penetration. You give up essentially mid-range shots. Really good players can get really good ball handlers can manage to get step back threes, et cetera, out of that. And also there's just a bit more space for error, right? Towns' issue is he could never get the spacing quite right. He would sag too far off, and a ball handler like a Kyrie would drop 45, just elbow jumpers all game long, or he wouldn't sag far enough and he'd get into foul trouble reaching, or he'd get beat off the bounce, getting past him, or the spacing just isn't quite right. Lob dunk over and over. You can't do that against Rudy Gobert because he's longer than Towns. He has a better feel defensively than Towns. His instincts are fantastic. He can block shots with both hands, all those things. And also he rebounds the position better than Towns too. So at times when he's on an island and he gets a stop, he could actually turn around and get the board as well. And those are all things he does better than Towns. So the optimal coverage for the Wolves is going to be pick and roll, or is going to be drop and pick and roll when Gobert is in the action. When he's off the floor, the Wolves had a lot of success blitzing pick and roll last year, essentially rushing the ball handler on the perimeter, at times doubling the ball handler out further, but essentially playing another term for that would be high wall coverage, where you're getting out on the perimeter, you're making life difficult for the person with the ball in their hands. You could beat it with accurate precision, quick passing. And that's one of the things that happened last year as the year went on, is teams figured out how to beat it. And they played like the better team you play, the easier it is to break a high wall coverage. If you have a veteran team, a team that's well coached, that's not super sloppy, that defense can be exploited fairly easily. And we saw that at times, which is why the Wolves went from a 6, 7, 8, 8th best defense in the league to like 12th or 13th by the end of the season. And they started mixing in other coverages. But it can be used as a tool in the toolbox for head coach Chris Finch. And D'Lo and Towns, it was a way to hide some of their deficiencies. So expect the Wolves to play drop most of the time, 2/3, 3/4 of the time, and then do some blitzing, do a little bit of switching, which they did late last year. Kyle Anderson is going to be a great switcher. Towns is still a pretty good switcher. There's still some positional flexibility that Finch has at his disposal. So I think the staggering of Rudy and Towns means that you'll see some switching of coverages based on personnel on the floor, based on the opponent. But you'll see a lot of drop with Rudy Gobert on the floor. And Chris Finch has essentially stated publicly over the past few days, the goal is to keep Towns or Rudy on the floor or Rudy at all times. And I think they could come really close, 42, 44 minutes a game. We talked about this the other day, to keep one or both those guys on the floor at all times. That really puts stress on the defense. You're talking about two of the top 20 players in the league, arguably two of the top 15 players in the league, and Rudy and Towns on the court at all times. You're going to have a pretty good team if that's the case. All right, that's all I have for you today here on the show. We've got one more player preview. That's Monday. It's Karl-Anthony Towns. We'll briefly on Tuesday preview Tuesday night's preseason game against the Miami Heat. And of course, Wednesday will be a post-game podcast. We won't post it. I won't get it posted right after the game Tuesday night like we will in the regular season. It is preseason after all, but it will post first thing Wednesday morning next week. So again, the show daily, Monday through Friday. Make sure you're following and subscribed wherever you listen to podcasts. A big thank you to those of you that do make Locked On Wolves your first listen every day. A reminder that you can you can watch on YouTube. Please subscribe, like the video, comment below. You can also follow and listen on your favorite audio platform. Please review there as well. It's definitely appreciated, and it helps us get in front of more folks. And again, means a lot. You can also follow the show on Twitter at Locked On T-Wolves and at Beecken with 2 B's, 2 E's, CKEN. Of course, the Locked On Wolves podcast is part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Remember, the Locked On Network is your local experts on all your favorite stories, on all the biggest stories, and your favorite stories, probably. A reminder that you can also make your second listen Locked On Fantasy Basketball. Our friend Josh Lloyd hosts the #1 daily fantasy basketball show on the planet. It's free and available wherever you get your podcasts. Once again, I'm Ben Beecken. This is the Locked On Wolves podcast, and we'll catch you next time.